Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Calder Boone rode into the yard just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, leaving the valley in a dull, fading light. His mare let out a low breath, steam rising from her muzzle as she stopped near the hitch rail. Calder swung a stiff leg over the saddle, feeling the usual pull in his back from a long day repairing the fence line. He expected the quiet to settle around him like it always did at this hour, the kind of silence that came from miles of empty land and days spent alone with routine. He took one step toward the cabin before his jaw tightened. The door wasn't shut. It hung a few inches open, pushed inward, swaying slightly with the cold draft that slipped through the gap. Calder stopped dead. That door never moved unless he moved it. He checked it every time he left, making sure the latch caught clean. His stomach tightened as his eyes scanned the ground. No clear tracks in the fading light. Nothing disturbed near the porch except the door itself. He wrapped the mare's reins around the post, fingers steady even though a low unease crawled into his chest. Someone was inside, or had been. He reached for the handle slowly, listening for the smallest shift of weight on the wooden floor. Nothing. He pushed the door open with 2 fingers. The hinges gave a soft groan. Inside, the air carried leftover smoke from a fire that hadn't been tended well. The coals glowed weakly in the stove, giving the room a faint orange tint. His boots touched the floorboards, and he scanned the shadows. A small sound, barely more than a scrape, came from the corner near the stove. He turned toward it, breath held, muscles tense to move if he had to. Then he saw her. An Apache woman sat curled on the floor, wrapped tight in one of his blankets. Her posture was tense, ready to spring up, but her exhaustion showed in the way her shoulders sagged and her head dipped slightly forward. Her long black hair clung wetly to her skin, damp from melted frost. The torn buckskin dress she wore had pulled apart at the seams from hard travel, leaving uneven strips of fabric hanging where they shouldn't. Her bare legs were pulled in close to her body for warmth. For a moment, Calder didn't move. He wasn't afraid. He just didn't understand what he was seeing, and surprise made him think slower than usual. His heartbeat kicked up, but he kept his breathing steady. Her eyes lifted toward him, dark, alert, frightened, yet controlled. She looked like someone who had run out of strength, but still had enough pride not to beg. "It was open," she whispered, her voice rough and thin. Calder didn't answer right away. He took one small step inside and shut the door behind him, sealing the cold out. His hand rested near his belt, not for a weapon, just out of habit. He studied her, evaluating the situation the same way he did when approaching a wounded animal or a cornered rider. No assumptions, no sudden movements. "I see that," he said finally. She flinched at the sound of his voice, not from the tone, but from the reality of being discovered. He saw the reaction, and part of him softened, not out of pity, but because she looked like someone who had reached her limit long before stepping inside his home. Calder crouched near the stove, putting his back partially to her, a small calculated risk that showed he wasn't planning to force her out or threaten her. He pushed the dying coals together and added another log, watching the embers brighten and catch. The new flame sent a wave of light across the room, revealing more details on her skin. Bruises along her arms, faint marks across her ribs, a trembling in her hands she tried to hide beneath the blanket. She pulled the edges tighter around her body, adjusting it to cover the torn parts of her dress. Calder pretended not to notice. His mind worked through possibilities. Why she was here, who she was running from, and what kind of trouble might follow. But the immediate thing he felt wasn't anger or frustration. It was concern, not for himself, for her. "You hurt anywhere?" he asked, eyes still on the fire. "No," she said quickly, too quickly. He heard the lie, but didn't challenge it. Not yet. He stood and removed his gloves, setting them on the table. His pulse had steadied, and his thoughts settled into order. The situation was unfamiliar, but the danger wasn't immediate. She wasn't attacking. She wasn't armed. She was just cold, exhausted, and scared. "Fire'll come back stronger in a minute," he said quietly. "You can stay there until it does." She watched him with a mixture of caution and confusion, as if trying to understand why he wasn't shouting, questioning, or pulling her up by the arm. Every man she had met recently had done something worse. He stepped back, giving her space instead of taking it. Her shoulders loosened a fraction. The room warmed slowly. Calder leaned against the table, studying her again with a calmer mind. She looked like she hadn't slept more than a handful of minutes and days. She looked like she had run until her body nearly quit on her. And she looked like she had expected a different kind of man to walk through that door, one who would take advantage of her weakness. He wasn't that man, and something in her expression shifted when she realized it. The fire grew steadily as the new log caught, sending warmer light into the corners of the room. Calder stayed where he was for a moment, letting the heat push back some of the coal that had slipped inside with the open door. He didn't move closer to her, didn't speak again right away. He wanted her to set her own pace. A frightened person backed into a corner made mistakes. He had learned that lesson more than once. She shifted slightly under the blanket, pulling one knee up to brace herself. The fabric slid enough for him to notice a tear along the side of her dress, the edges frayed from travel. She tugged the blanket higher to cover it, and her eyes flicked away, embarrassed, but not enough to break completely. He cleared his throat and stepped toward the shelf near the stove. "You eaten?" It came out simple, flat. He wasn't sure how much her nerves could handle. She hesitated, as if unsure whether the question was safe to answer. "No." Calder nodded once. That response told him what she feared, being asked to pay somehow for food she didn't yet have. He opened a tin of beans, poured them into a small iron pot, and set it near the edge of the stove. The beans began to warm slowly, giving off a faint, earthy smell that filled the cabin in a familiar way. Asha watched every movement he made. He could feel her gaze on his hands, on the way he handled the pot and the spoon. She was reading him the same way he was reading her, carefully and with the kind of attention born from surviving bad encounters. He dragged a chair toward the stove, not to sit, but to make sure she saw him settle into a calm posture. No fast movements, no tension in his shoulders, just steadiness. "You came far?" he asked after a long stretch of silence. Her fingers tightened on the blanket. "Yes." He waited for more, but she didn't add anything. He didn't push. He returned to stirring the beans, letting the quiet stretch between them. The room felt warmer now, the stove giving off enough heat that her shivers had started to ease. When the beans were ready, he filled a small tin bowl and walked toward her with slow steps. She straightened immediately, preparing herself for anything, and he stopped a few feet away so she didn't feel cornered. "Here," he said, holding the bowl out. Her hands shook as she reached for it, just enough that he saw her body was running on the last of its strength. She kept her eyes down while she took her first bite, eating slowly at first, then faster as hunger pushed past caution. He didn't comment on the speed. He just returned to the table and leaned a hip against it, arms crossed loosely, watching the fire instead of her face. He sensed her glancing at him between bites, trying to gauge whether he was annoyed, suspicious, or simply waiting for her to finish so he could tell her to leave. He showed none of that. He kept his breathing slow, kept his posture relaxed, because he knew tension could spark fear in someone who'd been running. When she set the empty bowl down with a soft clink, she whispered, "Thank you." "You're welcome." His voice was calm, even. "You can rest there by the stove. It throws the best heat." Her head lowered slightly, as if she hadn't expected the offer. She adjusted the blanket and eased down until she lay curled on her side, facing the fire. For the first time since he opened the door, she looked like she was allowing herself to breathe. Calder watched the way her eyelids fluttered as exhaustion tugged at her. She fought it for a few seconds, probably afraid she'd wake to someone standing over her. But her body was too spent to hold out. Her breathing slowed, becoming steady and deep. She was asleep. Calder exhaled softly. He didn't feel threatened anymore. What he felt was something closer to responsibility. She was hurt, alone, and terrified enough to break into a stranger's cabin. And yet she hadn't harmed anything, hadn't touched a weapon, hadn't acted aggressive once she realized who had walked in. He sat at the table, pulled out his knife, and began sharpening it, the slow, rhythmic scrape grounding his thoughts. His mind sifted through possibilities. What had driven her here? Who might come looking? Would they follow her tracks through the snow? He didn't like unanswered questions, but he also didn't want to wake her for answers she wasn't ready to give. The room warmed further. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the wooden walls. Inside, the only movement came from the small rise and fall of her breathing. He glanced toward the door once more to make sure it was locked, then returned to his seat. He wasn't used to sharing the cabin with anyone, but tonight the presence didn't feel intrusive. It felt like something that had happened for a reason he couldn't yet name. As the firelight shifted across her sleeping form, Calder felt a slow, unfamiliar pull in his chest, a mix of protectiveness, caution, and something he couldn't define yet. He didn't disturb her. He sharpened his knife, listened to the steady scrape of steel, and kept watch while she slept. The cabin woke slowly under the first thin line of morning light that pushed through the gaps in the shutters. The air inside had cooled during the night, but the stove still held enough warmth to keep the room from dipping into the uncomfortable cold that usually settled in by dawn. Calder stirred awake in his chair at the table, his neck stiff from sleeping upright. He rolled one shoulder, then the other, listening to the quiet before moving. Asha still lay curled near the stove, wrapped tightly in the blanket. Her breathing was steady, her face softer in sleep than it had been the night before. Without the tension gripping her features, she looked younger, though exhaustion still clung to her. Calder stood carefully, not wanting the floorboards to creak too loudly. He poured water into the coffee pot and set it on the stove. The metallic clang of the pot lid caused her eyes to snap open instantly, her hand gripping the blanket with sudden alarm. Her reaction was sharp, too sharp for someone who had rested so deeply. She pushed herself halfway up, breathing faster, her eyes tracking him as if trying to confirm where she was and whether danger had come again. Calder lifted both hands slightly, not in surrender, but as a gesture to show he wasn't approaching. "Just coffee," he said. "Nothing else." Her shoulders eased a fraction, but she kept her posture guarded. She shifted herself to sit upright, pulling the blanket around her torso to cover the torn fabric of her dress. For a moment, she watched him prepare the pot, studying the rhythm of his movements the way someone studies a stranger they aren't sure they can trust. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, her voice lower than last night, scraped from fatigue. "Most of the night," he answered, poking the coals to bring them back to life. "You needed it." Her expression tightened slightly, as if she didn't want him to see how worn she had been. She ran a hand over her hair, trying to tame the strands that had dried unevenly against her skin. "I shouldn't have stayed that long," she said. "You didn't have much choice," Calder replied. "Your body made that decision for you." That comment landed with more truth than she seemed comfortable with. She wrapped the blanket tighter and stayed silent until the coffee began to bubble. Calder poured a cup and placed it on the table, glancing toward her. "When you're ready," he said simply. She stood slowly, testing her legs, and he noticed the slight stiffness in her movements, the kind that came from running until the muscles cramped. She stepped toward the table with small, careful strides, positioning herself with the blanket still wrapped securely. She sat down across from him and lifted the cup with both hands for warmth. She took a sip, winced slightly at the bitterness, then drank again. "My name is Asha," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from the coffee. Calder remained still. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded once. "Calder Boone." She seemed to weigh the sound of his name before continuing. "You want to know why I came here? I figured you'd tell me when you felt ready." Asha blinked, taken aback by his patience. Most men would have demanded answers right away. He shrugged. "Most men cause the kind of trouble you were running from." That hit deeper than he intended, and her posture shifted as if she wasn't sure how to handle a man who didn't try to corner her with questions. She lowered the cup and drew in a slow breath. "My people were camped near the foothills," she began, choosing her words as carefully as someone stepping across cracked ice. "We had a small band, my mother's cousins, a few children. We stayed quiet. We hunted little. We didn't bother the ranchers." Calder listened without blinking or moving. He recognized the strain in her voice, the way trauma sat just beneath each sentence. "But riders came from the east 2 nights ago," she said. "White men. 5 of them. They said they were looking for strays, cattle, or horses, I don't know. But they acted like the land was theirs." Her hands tightened slightly around the cup. "There was an argument," she continued. "They wanted food, then they wanted more than that. One of them grabbed my cousin. My uncle pushed him away." She paused, throat tightening. "They pulled rifles. People scattered. I ran." Calder clenched his jaw. He didn't interrupt. I ran in the wrong direction, she said quietly. I crossed the ridge alone. I thought I heard them behind me. I don't know if they followed. That's why you were half frozen, Calder said. You didn't stop. She nodded. I stopped when I couldn't run anymore. I saw smoke from your cabin. I thought maybe no one lived here. She lifted her eyes to meet his. I didn't expect you. Calder leaned back in his chair, absorbing everything. He didn't doubt a word. Her exhaustion, the bruises, the torn dress. None of it felt staged or exaggerated. She had fled something real. You're safe here, he said. His tone wasn't dramatic or reassuring. It was grounded matter of fact. The kind of statement he only made when he knew he could keep it true. Asha studied him for a long moment. She seemed to search his expression for any sign of threat or expectation. Finding none, she lowered her gaze, letting out a careful breath she had been holding since she woke. I didn't mean to burden you, she whispered. You're not, he said. You needed shelter. You took it. That's all. Silence settled again, but it felt different from last night. Not tense, but cautious in a way that allowed trust to grow at its own pace. Asha wrapped her hand around the cup once more. The warmth steadied her. Calder watched her without pressing further, giving her space to decide what she needed next. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was someone with a story, and now he was part of it in a way neither of them had expected. Snow drifted lightly across the valley by mid-morning, thin flakes carried by a steady breeze that brushed against the cabin walls. Calder stepped outside with his coat half-buttoned, the cold hitting his face in a sharp wave that woke him fully. He moved toward the mare with slow, practiced steps, the kind that came from years of doing the same work alone. His mind stayed partly on the fence line he planned to check and partly on the woman inside the cabin. How tired she had looked, how carefully she had spoken, how she had watched the door each time it creaked. Asha stood near the small table when he came back in, still wrapped in his blanket, but moving with a clearer purpose than the night before. She had pushed her hair behind her shoulders and had begun straightening the items he had left out. The cup, the tin plate, the knife he used for carving, even the small stack of wood scraps near the stove. You don't need to do all that, he said as he set his gloves on the table. She didn't stop. I need to feel useful. The way she said it wasn't offensive. It was honest. Calder understood that kind of need. The urge to control something small when the bigger parts of life had slipped away. He nodded, not arguing. She wiped the table again, slower this time, as if relieved that he hadn't told her to sit down or stay put. You warm enough? He asked, tightening his coat before grabbing the saddle blanket. She nodded once. Better today. Her voice held more steadiness than before. The fire from last night had taken the worst of the cold out of her bones. Calder saddled the mare out front and checked the cinch twice. He had planned to head west first, then circle down toward the creek, but he hesitated a moment at the porch, glancing toward the door. The idea of leaving her completely alone didn't sit comfortably in his stomach. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't trust what, or who, might still be out there. Still, she needed the rest. He needed to check the fence. Routine came first. He rode out. Inside, Asha took slow steps across the wooden floor. Her legs still trembled a little, but she hid the weakness by moving deliberately. The blanket brushed the floor with each motion. She paused at a shelf near the far wall, studying the tools and folded linens, as if trying to learn the shape of this man's life. Everything had its place. Nothing looked wasted. She picked up a small piece of cloth he used for wiping dust from the table and folded it cleanly. Then she gathered the bowls from last night, rinsed them with cold water from the basin, and dried them near the stove. Her hands steadied with each task, her breathing less shallow. The cabin was simple. One bed, one table, a stove, a trunk with a broken corner. She scanned the room slowly, absorbing the details like someone trying to memorize a place she might need to recall under pressure. She paused at the doorway and listened. No horses, no voices, just wind. She stayed inside. Calder returned 2 hours later with snow accumulating on his coat. He set the tools down by the door and stomped the slush from his boots. Asha straightened from where she was kneeling near the trunk, her hands resting on her lap, as if she wasn't sure whether she had overstepped. "I'll put things back how they were," she said quickly. He studied the room. It wasn't perfectly arranged. He didn't work with that kind of precision, but it was cleaner, tidier, calm in a way he didn't realize he had missed. "You did fine," he said simply. A small, almost unnoticeable shift crossed her expression. She relaxed her shoulders. He moved past her to set more wood beside the stove, and she stepped aside without him needing to speak, reading his intention before he finished the motion. She opened the stove door for him without being asked. He placed 2 logs inside. Neither commented on the cooperation. It just happened. Shared movement. Shared space. No tension. Later, they ate a small midday meal, bread and leftover beans. Asha ate slower this time, not rushing the food. Calder noticed she kept glancing toward the window, watching the snow lighten as the clouds began to thin. "You're still expecting them," he said. She didn't deny it. "I don't know how far they followed." He took a drink of water and set the cup down. "Nothing out there right now except snow. That doesn't mean they're gone." "No," he admitted, "it doesn't." Her eyes searched him, not for answers, but for the measure of his certainty. She needed to know whether he was the kind of man who noticed danger early. She needed someone who wouldn't panic if trouble arrived again. Calder leaned back in his chair. "If anyone comes near, I'll see them first." The statement was simple, not promised lightly. Asha absorbed it with a slow breath, her gaze lowering to the table as if the tension in her chest eased by one small degree. In the afternoon, Calder brought in the saddle and hung it near the wall. Asha swept the floor using a thin broom that looked like it had been repaired several times. They worked in comfortable silence, neither overstepping, neither pretending the situation was more or less than it was. At one point, he stepped aside to let her pass, and she moved close enough that he caught the faint scent of cold air and would smoke in her hair. She didn't flinch the way she had the night before. For the first time, she looked settled, not safe, not yet, but grounded enough to breathe. When evening approached, Calder prepared a small pot of stew, and Asha sat on the floor near the stove, warming her hands. He handed her a spoon without looking directly at her, and she accepted it with a quiet "thank you" that came more naturally now. The snow outside slowed, leaving the yard covered in a pale sheet of white. The cabin held a steady warmth, the kind that made the space feel less temporary. Calder took a seat near the table and watched the flames in the stove dance in controlled patterns. Asha watched him from where she sat, studying his calm presence, trying to understand what kind of man could offer shelter without expecting something in return. Their eyes met once, brief, steady, unguarded. Neither looked away in discomfort. Neither felt the need to speak. The routine of 2 had begun, and neither of them tried to deny the quiet shift happening beneath it. Night settled quietly over the valley, bringing a deeper cold that crept across the cabin floorboards and pushed the shadows farther into the corners. Calder closed the shutters one by one, checking the latches out of habit. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that made every small sound clearer. The soft clink of the kettle shifting on the stove, the gentle crackle of burning wood, the faint rustle of Asha adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. Asha sat near the stove, her legs folded beneath her, her posture steady despite the stiffness that still lingered in her muscles. She had cleaned up after their meal without being asked, wiping each dish carefully before setting it on the shelf. Calder watched her move, quiet, sure, deliberate, as if reclaiming dignity through every small task. The lantern on the wall had burned low. Calder reached for the flint and stepped closer to light it. The room held only the orange glow of the stove, not enough to see the far corners. "Hold the base," he said gently. Asha rose from her spot, gathering the blanket around her, and stepped toward him. She moved slowly, still cautious, but not with the same fear she had carried the night she arrived. She reached out and steadied the lantern with both hands. Her palms pressed firmly against the cold metal. Calder struck the flint. Sparks flicked upward, briefly illuminating their faces in short bursts of pale light. She didn't flinch. He noticed. The wick caught on the 3rd strike. Flame rose in a small, controlled arc, brightening the space between them. The warm light revealed details neither had looked at directly before. The faint curve of her cheek where bruising had begun to fade, the way her torn buckskin dress shifted slightly at her shoulder when she inhaled, the tired determination in her eyes that hadn't dimmed despite everything she had endured. Calder kept one hand on the lantern post, the other lowering the flint. Asha still held the base, and they were suddenly standing closer than either had intended. Her breath slowed. So did his. The lantern's glow drew their faces into clear view, the warmth from the flame softening the severity of the cabin's rough edges. Asha looked up first, not because she wanted to challenge him, but because she needed to see whether he meant her harm or safety. What she found made her chest loosen. There was no threat in him, only steady awareness. Calder didn't move away. He watched the way she steadied herself, the way her hands held firm on the lantern even though the heat from the glass brushed her knuckles. "You cold?" he asked, his voice low, not pressing her for anything more. "No," she said quietly, "not with a fire like this." Their eyes held for a long moment. Not tense, not uncertain, just honest. Asha released the lantern carefully. Calder's fingers brushed hers for a brief second, a small accidental touch that sent a faint tension through both of them. Not fear, not discomfort, something quieter. Something that felt like recognition. He didn't look away. She didn't step back. The distance between them was small, defined only by breath. Her dress, torn at the neckline from travel, had slipped slightly when she moved her arm. It wasn't deliberate. The fabric had simply lost its strength. Asha noticed it a second later and pulled the blanket closer, but the gesture wasn't rushed. She didn't shrink from him the way she had before. Calder saw the shift, her comfort returning slowly, naturally, and he felt something in his chest settle. He wasn't used to sharing space like this. He wasn't used to wanting to. The room was quiet except for the fire and the soft buzz of the lantern flame. "Asha," he said, not commanding, just acknowledging her presence in a way that made her lift her chin. "Yes, you're safe here." He said it without hesitation, without ceremony. The certainty in his voice wasn't forced. It was simply the truth he already felt responsible for. She held his gaze. For the first time, she believed him fully. When she spoke, her voice softened in a way he hadn't heard until now. "You didn't have to help me." "I know." "Then why did you?" she asked. Not accusing, not frightened, just trying to understand the man who had taken her in without asking for anything back. He took a slow breath, and his eyes didn't leave hers. "Because you needed someone to stay still long enough for you to stop running." The honesty of the answer settled between them, steady and heavy in a comforting way. Asha stepped half a pace closer, small, controlled, intentional. Calder didn't move away. Their faces were close enough now that he could see the faint tremble in her breath, not from fear, but from the weight of everything she had held alone until this moment. She reached up slowly, giving him every chance to pull back. He didn't. Her hand rested lightly on his wrist, not gripping, not pleading, just grounding herself to something solid. He felt the warmth of her touch travel up his arm in a slow, steady line. When he finally leaned forward, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't uncertain. It was the natural movement of a man who hadn't touched another soul in years and a woman who hadn't had a safe place to stand in even longer. Their lips met in a quiet, steady kiss, soft, aware, unhurried. A moment built from silence, from trust, from the simple truth that neither of them wanted to feel alone anymore. When they separated, Asha didn't look away. "You didn't turn from me," she whispered. Calder held her gaze. "I didn't want to." The lantern light flickered behind them. The fire glowed warm at their backs. And for the first time since their lives had collided, neither of them felt the instinct to step away. The next morning brought a hard, bright cold, the kind that made the air feel thin and sharp when Calder stepped outside. Frost clung to the railings, the water trough, and the shed door. The mare snorted once, shaking her mane as he tightened her cinch. Calder checked the sky out of habit. Clear, too clear. Weather like this carried sound far, and trouble tended to travel well on crisp mornings. Inside the cabin, Asha sat wrapped in a blanket, warming her hands around a cup of coffee. Her hair hung loose today, falling over her shoulders in dark, uneven strands. She looked steadier, but her eyes followed him every time he moved toward the door. "You'll be gone long?" she asked. "Not long," he answered, sliding his gloves on. "Just checking the creek line. Snow melts faster down there." She nodded, but didn't hide the concern tightening her jaw. "If you see riders, I'll see them before they see me," he said, not as reassurance, but as fact. Calder stepped outside and shut the door quietly behind him. The ride to the creek took 15 minutes. The The sun glinted off the frozen patches of ground, lighting the valley in stark whites and dull grays. Calder kept his posture loose in the saddle, but his eyes active, scanning the horizon, the tree line, the breaks in the snow. He guided the mare toward the creek bed, where thin sheets of ice formed and broke under the slight warming of the morning. He dismounted near a bend in the creek where the mud stayed soft beneath the frost. That was when he saw it. Boot prints. Not old, not washed out. Fresh. Calder crouched and placed 2 fingers along the edge of the imprint. The depth told him the rider was carrying gear or weighed heavy. The angle of the heel told him the man had been moving with purpose, not wandering. The stride was unbroken. Whoever it was had passed through without pausing. His stomach tightened. Someone had been close. Too close. He followed the trail a short distance, careful not to disturb the prints. The horse tracks beside them matched the boot marks. Single rider, strong horse, not a ranch animal. More likely a man used to long travel. The prints cut toward the ridge, then vanished where the ground turned rocky. Calder straightened slowly and exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath meant to settle the instinctive tension building in his shoulders. The timing wasn't coincidence. Asha hadn't been wrong. She had been followed. He mounted the mare and turned her back toward the cabin, pushing the pace faster now. Snow kicked up behind them in thin bursts. Asha was near the stove when Calder stepped inside, his boots hitting the floor harder than usual. She stood immediately, reading his posture before he spoke. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice tight. "Tracks," he said, hanging his coat. "Fresh ones." Her face went still, not shocked, not panicked, but deeply aware. How many? One man, maybe more nearby. Hard to say. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "I thought I lost them. I thought the cold would slow them down." Calder studied her, noting how her breathing sharpened, how her hands dug slightly into the blanket. He didn't want to push her back into fear, but he needed the truth. "Are they the same men who came to your camp?" he asked. She nodded once, slow but certain. "They don't give up easily. If they think something belongs to them, they follow until they take it." Calder felt something shift inside him. Not anger, but a grounded resolve, the kind that formed when a threat crossed a line. He had survived enough conflict to know the type of men she described. Men who acted like the world was theirs to claim. He stepped closer, resting a hand on the back of the nearest chair. "You're not alone now. They'll find this place harder than they expect." Asha looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any uncertainty. Finding none, she released a slow breath. "What if they come today?" she asked. "Then I'll be ready," he said simply. She lowered herself onto the wooden stool by the stove, absorbing his words in silence. Calder could see her trying to steady her thoughts, fear pushing one way, the memory of last night pulling another. "You think they know I'm here?" she asked quietly. "Someone rode close," he said, close enough to try and see something. "But the cabin windows don't give much away, and the snow covers tracks fast. They didn't come up to the porch." Asha nodded, gripping the blanket around her shoulders. Calder poured her a cup of warm water, the closest thing to tea they had left. She accepted it with both hands. He noted how her fingers trembled only slightly this time. "You did right coming here," he said, voice low. She blinked, surprised he meant it. "You think so?" she asked. "I do," he said. "You needed shelter. And I know the kind of men who scare people into running. You weren't wrong to get away." She swallowed, the tension in her face loosening a fraction. "I just didn't expect someone to help me." Calder shrugged lightly. "Sometimes help comes from places you don't expect." Asha held the warm cup close to her chest and let the heat settle her breath. Calder watched her for a moment, noticing the way her shoulders dropped slightly as exhaustion wore through her fear, the way her eyes softened as if she was beginning to trust the ground she stood on. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the walls. Inside, the tension sat between them, but not in a dangerous way. More like the steady awareness before challenge, something they would face together whether they had planned to or not. Asha finally spoke again, her voice steady this time. "If they come, I won't hide behind you." Calder held her gaze. "I won't ask you to." She nodded once, firm, grounded, ready. The moment settled into quiet understanding. The threat now had a shape, a distance, a direction, and neither of them intended to face it alone. Snow thinned by late afternoon, leaving the valley under a pale stretch of light. Calder spent the day close to the cabin, cutting wood and checking the eastern fence while Asha stayed inside, repairing what she could of her dress with a bone needle she kept tied at her hip. They said little, but silence had become something steady between them, something that didn't need filling. By sundown, the air began to settle into the familiar cold that came before nightfall. Calder stepped onto the porch to bring in the last armful of firewood. That was when he heard it. Hoofbeats. Slow, measured, deliberate. The sound traveled across the valley with no attempt at hiding. Calder froze for half a heartbeat, then placed the wood down quietly and reached for the rifle leaning by the door. He didn't raise it, didn't need to yet. He stepped onto the porch fully and scanned the ridgeline. 2 riders came into view, silhouettes against the fading sky. Their coats were heavy, dusted with frost, their horses moving with the steady confidence of men who traveled far without tiring. They were headed straight toward his land, not passing through, not wandering. Purposeful. Inside the cabin, Asha straightened from her seat near the stove. She hadn't heard the voices yet, but she sensed the shift in Calder's steps. Quieter, firmer, heavier in a way that meant something had changed. "Calder," she called, standing. "They're here," he said through the crack in the door, voice low but controlled. Asha's breath hitched. She moved to the window and took her place just beside the frame where she could see out without being seen. Her eyes sharpened instantly, her body tightening in ways that showed memory rather than fear. She recognized the kind of posture men carried when they believed the world owed them something. The riders stopped by the fence, their horses snorting clouds into the cold air. One man was tall with a strong jaw and deep lines around his mouth, someone who smiled rarely. The other was heavier, thick through the shoulders, his coat torn at the sleeve as though he'd ridden hard without stopping. Calder walked to the edge of the porch, stopping where the last board met the snow. He didn't shout. He didn't approach their horses. He stayed exactly where he needed to stand, a man protecting his home without turning the moment into a challenge. The taller rider lifted his chin. "Evening," he called. Calder didn't move except to adjust his stance. "Evening. We're tracking someone," the man said, looking past Calder toward the windows. "Figure she might have come through here." Calder kept his face unreadable. "This land isn't open for searching." The heavier rider let out a short laugh. "We're just looking for what don't belong out here." Calder didn't blink. "Nothing here belongs to you." Inside the cabin, Asha gripped the windowsill so tightly her knuckles whitened. She didn't tremble. She wasn't shrinking, but her jaw clenched hard enough that the muscle near her ear tightened visibly. These were the voices she'd heard the night everything fell apart. She recognized the tone, the entitlement, the calculation. The tall man leaned forward in his saddle. "Look, we don't want trouble. We just want to make sure no strays wandered this way." Calder tilted his head slightly, the closest he came to a smirk. Nothing here strayed. A quiet moment followed, long enough for the cold to settle deeper, long enough for the danger to become clear. The heavier rider shifted his hand toward his coat, near the holster. Not drawing, testing, seeing what Calder would do if he reached farther. Calder responded by planting his boots more firmly. He didn't touch his rifle. He didn't lift his head, but his posture changed just enough that even from inside the cabin, Asha felt the air tighten. The tall man exhaled sharply through his nose. "We'll have a look around. Then we'll be on our way." Calder's voice didn't rise, but it lost all softness. "No, you won't." Both men stiffened. Asha's breath stopped. The heavier rider angled his horse for his step. Calder didn't budge. "This isn't your decision," the tall man said. Calder stepped closer to the edge of the porch, just one measured stride. It wasn't aggressive, just firm. "You crossed into my land without permission. You're not taking one more step." The wind cut between them like a cold blade, but no one moved. The men exchanged looks. The heavier one's jaw ticked. The tall one's eyes narrowed, calculating whether Calder was bluffing. He wasn't. Calder stood with the quiet certainty of someone who meant every word and could back them without hesitation. Finally, the tall rider clicked his tongue and pulled on the reins. "Let's go." The heavier rider hesitated, eyes locked on Calder, testing him one last time. Calder didn't blink. After a slow moment, the man turned his horse. They rode off toward the ridge, their silhouettes shrinking until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the cold air. Calder didn't turn around immediately. He listened until he was certain the men were far enough they couldn't double back without being heard. Only then did he step inside, closing the door behind him. Asha stood stiff near the window, wrapped in the blanket, her breathing shallow from holding too much in for too long. Calder set the rifle down gently and met her eyes. They're gone. She swallowed hard. For now, he agreed. But they didn't get what they came for. Asha stepped closer, not out of fear, but out of something steadier, something like choice. She touched the edge of his sleeve, her fingers trembling slightly. You stood for me, she said. Calder looked down at her hand, then back at her face. This is my home. You're here. That makes you under my protection. Her breath shuddered once, but not from fear. It sounded like relief. She didn't let go of his sleeve. He didn't step back. In that moment, the danger outside felt distant, and the bond between them drew tighter, not from words, but from what he had proven without hesitation. They were no longer just sharing cabin. They were facing the same direction, the same threat, the same future, whether either of them had planned it or not. The night settled heavy over the cabin, thicker and quieter than the one before. No wind, no shifting branches, no animal calls from the ridge. Just a stillness so complete that every sound inside felt sharper. The soft clink of the stove settling, the faint scrape of Asha adjusting her blanket, the controlled breath Calder released after standing guard at the window for a long stretch of time. He hadn't lit the lantern. The fire alone kept the room visible, glowing across the wooden walls in slow waves. Light made a man visible from far off, and Calder wasn't in the mood to offer anyone a clear target. Asha stood beside the window, not directly in front of it, but close enough to watch the open valley. Her posture stayed tight, not from panic, but from the weight of memory. The same men who had torn apart her camp had stopped at this property. She kept replaying the sound of their voices in her mind, hearing the same tone they had used when grabbing her cousin, when pulling rifles, when demanding what was never theirs. Calder set his rifle against the wall and stretched his hands toward the stove to warm them. His jaw stayed tight, and he kept glancing at the door with a steady, assessing look. He was thinking through the angles, the blind spots, the terrain, preparing without admitting it out loud. You think they'll come back? Asha asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. He picked up another piece of kindling and placed it on the fire, watching the flames lick up its edges. If they do, he said finally, they won't try talking first next time. Asha swallowed hard. They think I belong to them. Calder turned his head toward her, his voice steady, but carrying a deeper note now. You don't. She didn't look away. They won't accept that. They're leaving this land alive only if they do, he said, not raising his tone, not speaking in threat, just stating the outcome he was prepared to enforce. Asha breathed out slowly, grounding herself. She moved away from the window and sat near the stove. Calder watched her gather the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her dress hung unevenly where the seams had torn, showing the curves of her waist and the bruising along her upper arm. She didn't hide them anymore, not from him. Calder sat across from her, ensuring he could see both the door and the window from where he rested. She studied him, how he sat with one foot planted firmly, how his hand rested near his belt, how his awareness never drifted far from the room's edges. You've dealt with men like them before, she said after a long pause. Too many times, he replied. Did you win? He met her eyes. I survived. She nodded, understanding the difference. Hours passed without either of them sleeping. Asha worked a small carved token between her fingers, something tied to a strip of her dress earlier. It wasn't decorative. It looked like a piece of her past she refused to let go. Calder set a small tin cup of warm water beside her. She accepted it with a grateful glance but didn't drink immediately. She watched the fire instead, the orange glow reflecting in her dark eyes. Why do you live alone? She asked. Calder didn't shift. Quieter that way. No one waiting for you. No, he said simply. She hesitated. By choice. By necessity, he corrected. Some lives fit better alone. Asha listened closely to the tone beneath his words. There was no bitterness there, no regret, just a man who had been shaped by hard ground and long stretches of silence. She took a sip of the warm water. And now you're not alone. He raised his eyes to hers. You're not either. The truth of that settled heavily in the small room. A sudden crack in the distance snapped their attention toward the door. Calder stood instantly, silent but alert. Asha's breath caught. She placed the cup down carefully and rose to her feet, moving to stand just behind him. They waited. Another sound, closer. A horse's huff. The faint clink of metal on a saddle. Calder motioned with 2 fingers for Asha to stay behind him, but within reach. She obeyed without argument, pressing her shoulder lightly against the wall as she steadied her breathing. The footsteps of a man approached the porch boards, slow, testing the weight before stepping again. Calder lifted his rifle, but kept it pointed slightly downward, ready but not yet drawn. A firm knock struck the door. Not frantic, not uncertain. Confident. Asha stiffened. Calder didn't answer. A second knock followed, slower this time. Boom! A familiar voice called from outside. One of the riders from earlier, the tall one. We need one more word. Calder didn't move from his position. His voice came low. You're done talking. A beat of silence. The rider exhaled, the breath visible through the crack under the door. You're protecting someone who doesn't belong here. Calder lifted the rifle slightly. She belongs where she chooses to stand. The boards outside creaked under shifting weight. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, Calder answered. I'm making it clear. Another silence. The kind that told Calder the man was deciding whether to push this into violence. Then the sound of boots stepping off the porch. A saddle shifting. Reins pulled. Calder didn't lower the rifle until the horse retreated far enough that only wind remained. Inside, Asha's knees wavered as the tension drained all at once. She reached for the table to steady herself. Calder set the rifle down and crossed the room in 2 steps. You all right? He asked. She nodded, though her breath still trembled. They'll come back. I know, and when they do, Calder held her gaze. I'll be ready, and you won't face them alone. Asha didn't hesitate this time. She stepped closer, close enough that her blanket brushed his chest, close enough that he could see the fear and resolve mixing in her eyes. She raised a hand slowly and placed it over his heart. Light, cautious, warm. You didn't have to stand between us, she whispered. Yes, I did. Her breath steadied. Then I'll stand with you. Calder didn't touch her, but he didn't move away either. His voice came quiet but firm. Then they'll have to go through both of us. Asha nodded once, calm, certain. The fire burned low behind them. The danger outside waited. But for the first time since the day she ran, she felt like she wasn't running anymore. She had someone who stood his ground, and he had someone who chose to stay. Dawn crept in slowly, pale and colorless, settling over the valley like a thin sheet of frost. The cabin felt warmer than the outside world, but tension still lingered in the corners of the room from the night before. Neither Calder nor Asha had slept. They had taken turns watching the window, listening for hoofbeats, waiting for the riders to return. They did not. By mid-morning, the sky cleared, leaving a wide stretch of sunlight over the snow. Calder stepped outside, just long enough to check the tracks near the fence. They were already fading, softened by fresh powder and wind. The riders had moved on for now, but he knew men like that rarely quit easily. They would think. They would regroup. They might circle back. When he re-entered the cabin, Asha was sitting at the table, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair falling loosely across her back. She looked tired but grounded. Her eyes followed him as he hung his coat by the door. You checked the ridge? She asked. Yes. They're gone. For now, Calder said. But they'll consider coming again. Asha didn't flinch. She had reached a point where nothing surprised her anymore. Not danger, not hardship, not the idea of someone coming to take her away. She had lived with threats too long to fear the next one as sharply. But Calder noticed something different today. She wasn't bracing herself alone. She wasn't curling inward. She was looking straight at him, as though she had already decided something he hadn't yet spoken. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. You should rest, he said. She shook her head. I won't sleep today. He sat across from her. The fire crackled softly, giving a steady rhythm to the silence. Asha studied him for a long moment before speaking. Last night, when you stood between me and the door, I didn't understand it at first. Calder remained still, waiting. She continued, her voice steady but low. You could have told them I wasn't here. You could have given them what they wanted. It would have ended quickly. Calder looked up at her directly. That's not how I handle things. Asha's fingers curled around the blanket, grounding herself. Why? He didn't look away. Because letting them take you would sit wrong in every part of me. Asha's breath caught, not with fear, but with a quiet emotional weight she hadn't expected. She stood slowly and walked toward the stove, as if she needed movement to steady herself. She touched the edge of the warm iron, absorbing its heat through the blanket. When I ran, she said quietly, I didn't look back. I didn't think anyone would help me. I didn't think anyone would care. I just wanted to stay alive long enough to find someplace quiet. Calder stepped toward her, not too close, but close enough to show he was listening. You found quiet here, he said. She nodded, but I didn't expect to find someone willing to fight for me. He inhaled deeply, letting her words settle. You're not a burden, Asha, and you're not something for anyone to claim. She turned toward him, her eyes steady, not wavering now. Then let me tell you what I choose. His throat tightened slightly, though he didn't show it. I choose to stay, she said. Not because I'm cornered. Not because I'm hiding. Because you didn't look at me like something broken. Because you didn't ask for anything in return. Calder's jaw set, but the expression wasn't hard. It was touched with something tense and quiet, like a man learning how to accept someone's trust again after years of closing the door on it. Asha stepped closer, her blanket brushing his coat. She reached up slowly and placed her hand against his chest, right over his heartbeat. Her touch was gentle, unguarded. Calder felt the warmth of her palm through the fabric. You protected me, she whispered. Not as something owed, but as someone you wanted to keep safe. He didn't deny it. He didn't step away. He placed his hand lightly on her waist, not pulling her in, just resting there. A steady, grounded touch. I want you here, he said. The words were simple but honest. Not as a guest. Not until the riders stop coming. As long as you choose it. She didn't even take a full breath before answering. I choose it. There was no hesitation. No fear. No uncertainty. Asha leaned into him, letting her forehead rest lightly against his shoulder. Calder lowered his head, breathing in the faint scent of her hair. Smoke, cold air, and something uniquely her. He wrapped one arm around her, slow and sure, giving her enough space to pull away if she needed to. She didn't. They held there for a long moment, saying nothing. The kind of silence people shared only when they finally stopped running. When Asha pulled back, her eyes shone with quiet certainty. Whatever comes, we face it together. Calder nodded once. Together. Her hand slipped into his. His fingers closed around hers with natural certainty, something that felt earned, not forced. The danger from the riders still lingered somewhere in the distance, but the cabin no longer felt like a place of hiding. It felt like a place chosen, a place where two people had decided, without needing to speak it aloud, that they weren't alone anymore. A home wasn't just walls and fire. It was the person who stayed when everyone else left. And for the first time in years, Calder felt like this was home for both of them. The next morning arrived calm and clear, the cold softer than usual, the sky a steady pale blue stretching above the valley. Calder stepped outside first, his breath rising in slow white clouds. He scanned the ridges, the tree line, the open trail that cut through the snow. No movement, no hoofbeats, no sign of the riders. For the first time since Asha arrived, the land felt quiet in a way that didn't carry tension. Just morning stillness. Inside the cabin, Asha folded the blanket she had slept under and placed it neatly on the bed. She moved with an ease she hadn't shown before. Less guarded, more grounded. Her bruises had begun to fade. Her steps were steady. When she looked toward the door, her eyes didn't carry the fear of someone expecting danger at any second. Calder entered, stamping snow from his boots. Ridge is clear, he said. They're not coming back. Asha breathed out slowly. You're certain? As certain as a man can be, he replied. They rode off yesterday knowing they'd get nothing here. And men like that don't enjoy failure. They'll try somewhere else. Not here. Asha nodded, not out of blind trust, but because she believed him. She had seen the way he stood against those riders. She had seen the way he guarded the cabin all night. The certainty in his voice wasn't arrogance. It was experience. Calder took off his coat and hung it by the door. A moment passed, quiet, familiar, before he spoke again. You don't have to leave, he said. The words came steady, not hesitant, like something he had decided after a long night of thinking. You don't need to find someplace else or keep running. You can stay here with me. This home is big enough for two. Asha studied him, not rushing the moment. You mean that? I do. What about the men who might come again? She asked. Calder stepped closer, stopping just in front of her. If trouble finds us, we face it together. Not as strangers. Not as someone sheltering someone else. As people who built something side by side. Asha's eyes softened. And what is it we're building, Calder Boone? He took a slow breath. A life. The room felt warmer than the fire could make it. Her gaze didn't waver as she stepped closer, the torn edges of her dress brushing lightly against his shirt. She touched his forearm gently, grounding herself with the quiet confidence that had grown between them. I want that too, she said. A life that isn't running. A life where I wake and see someone who stands with me. Someone who doesn't look at me like I'm something to take. Calder's expression shifted, soft, resolute. You're someone to choose, Asha. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in something full and steady. She reached up and rested her palm lightly against his cheek, her thumb brushing a faint line near his jaw. He didn't move away. He leaned into her touch. What happens now, she asked. We start fresh, he said. Not as a man giving shelter, not as a woman escaping danger. As two people deciding not to be alone anymore. Asha nodded slowly, meaningfully. Then I stay. The simplicity of the statement carried the weight of everything she had endured. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't circumstance. It was choice. Calder lifted her hand from his cheek and held it between both of his. He drew her closer, not forcefully, but with the steady pull of someone who knew exactly what he wanted and respected every inch of her space. When she stepped fully into his arms, the decision felt complete. They kissed, warm, unhurried, certain. Not a moment born from fear or exhaustion, but one that marked the beginning of what they chose together. The rest of the day moved quietly, the way new beginnings often do. Calder repaired the barn hinge that had loosened in the wind. Asha tended the mare, brushing out the winter coat with slow, confident strokes. When she worked, she carried herself with belonging, not as a visitor, not as someone temporary. Inside the cabin, she placed her carved token on the table near the stove, not as something she clung to for safety, but as a piece of her past finding a place in her future. Calder noticed it when he came in. He paused, understanding the significance without her needing to explain. You planning to keep that here? He asked. She nodded. It belongs in a home. This is mine now. Calder didn't smile often, but something close to it pulled at the corner of his mouth. He stepped behind her and rested a hand on her waist, gentle and certain. The marinade softly outside. The fire crackled. Snow drifted lightly past the window. Life didn't change with grand gestures out here. It changed with quiet choices. Asha turned to him, leaning her forehead against his chest. I never thought I'd find a place where I could stop looking over my shoulder. You found one, he said, wrapping his arms around her. And you're safe here, with me. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the cabin, the steadiness of his hold, and the peace of the valley settle into her bones. Then this is home. Calder pressed a soft kiss against the top of her head. Our home. The words settled between them with certainty. As evening came, they stood together outside the cabin, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. Neither spoke. They simply stood side by side, sharing the same view, the same breath, the same quiet gratitude. Asha reached for his hand. Calder took it immediately, their fingers intertwining with easy familiarity. No threats approached. No hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Only peace. A peace they had earned. A peace they would defend together. And when they stepped back into the cabin, now their cabin, they did so with the clear, undeniable understanding that this was the beginning of a shared life. A home for two, chosen freely, held firmly, built in silence, trust, and staying.